It was once said that no European island lies in so lamentable and hostile a solitude as Ireland, who has no neighbour on her right hand but her conqueror, and nothing at all on her left hand but the desolate ocean. Not one dry step until you get to America. The location of this once wild land on the continent's outermost fringes has certainly helped shape its fortunes. For the story of Ireland is very much a story of resistance to England, the dominant partner in a geographically enforced marriage, who has often abused her, but more often simply neglected her. Neglect is nothing new to a land that was once thought to be on the very edge of the world. Ireland has been a home to man since the earliest times. On the denuded lunar-like surface of the Burren, a vast limestone plateau that covers much of County Clare, evidence of ancient peoples stands proud in stone. The same is true all over Ireland. From the bleakness of Roscommon's Brickleave Mountains, megalithic burial sites rise up out of the landscape. But the most spectacular proof that humans walked these lands long before the birth of Christ comes from the passage graves that lie alongside the River Boyne at Newgrange. These suggest that Ireland was inhabited as early as 7000 BC. One of Europe's most significant prehistoric sites, this huge circular man-made mound, although now largely covered with grass and earth, is made of white and black boulders. It was once surrounded by a great circle of standing stones, witnesses to man's reverence for the power of the sun, a power that was harnessed by a unique aperture in the roof box above the entrance, which is so arranged that the sun's rays penetrate to illuminate the chamber within only at the winter solstice. But it is to a later age that Ireland owes the foundation of its cultural roots. This granite boulder at Turow in County Galway dates from the 3rd century BC, and its intricate designs, also found at places like Lateen on the continent, are the marks of a civilization that came mainly from France and Spain, the Celts. The Celts, or Gaels, brought a sophisticated tradition to Ireland. Farmers and herdsmen, they were grouped in clans that were divided into families. The spirit of Irish Celtic greatness is perhaps best recalled through one place, of which an early poet wrote, "Great, noble and beautiful truly was our Tara of the kings." For it was here that the triennial parliament was founded 7 or 8 centuries before Christ. The great, beautiful hill boasted many buildings, including a great banqueting hall. Celtic society comprised numerous small kingdoms, and each of the provincial kings had, on Tara, a house that was set aside for him when he came up to attend the great parliament. There was also an assembly of the people in general, where the ancient laws were recited and confirmed, new laws were enacted, disputes settled, and wrongs righted. Puck's Fair, 3 days of revelry that takes place each August in the Kerry town of Kiloglan, may seem a long way from ancient Tara. But when people gather here to celebrate and enjoy the crack, they are very much in tune with the storytelling tradition practiced by the Celts for 1,000 years before the introduction of writing. There is also another way in which Puck's Fair links the present to early Celtic tradition. The focal point of this extravaganza is the parading and elevating to great height of a goat.
And here he comes, His Majesty, Puck Fair, King of Puck 1999, and Puck on goat. In case you're wondering what's happening, you're in Killarney on the first day of Puck. And traditionally, we crown a wild mountain goat as King of the Fair. Nobody knows why we do it. Nobody cares why we do it. We just do it.
Noble friends, we are gathered here once more to celebrate an ancient and cherished tradition, handed down to us from our forefathers and from their forefathers before them.
Why such an unwitting beast should have such nobility thrust upon it may be of little consequence to most visitors. But, whether they are aware of it or not, the ennobling of the goat is a throwback to pagan Celtic ritual sacrifice. But the Celts didn't rely solely on their gods for protection. By the end of the 2nd century, fearing invasion by the Romans, who occupied neighbouring Britain, they founded a great standing army, led by Finn MacCool. Known as the Fenians, they pledged to guard the harbours from foreign invaders. In the event, the Romans never set foot upon these shores. But what happened next was both influenced by and influential upon Celtic culture, and represented another step in the development of a unique Irish identity. It was here, in Strangford Lough, on a wet and blustery day such as this, that in the year 432, a ship was blown ashore by the wind and tide. On board was a missionary and bishop who was returning to Ireland. One day he would be known everywhere as St. Patrick. It is unlikely that the appearance of Christianity in Ireland was the result of one mission. It probably spread gradually from Roman Britain through trade, piracy, and the presence of captured slaves. By the early 5th century, Christianity was sufficiently widespread in the south of the country for the Pope to send a deacon to administer to them. A succession of missionaries followed, and St. Patrick was simply one of them, working amongst the still pagan peoples in the north of the country. However, he was by far the most influential. Given the circumstances, it is not surprising that the man destined to become Ireland's patron saint was actually born in England. The son of a civil servant in Roman Britain, Patrick was abducted and sold into slavery in County Antrim.
During that time he had his conversion experience. I mean, he actually attributes his captivity to the fact that he didn't listen to his priests. So on the hillside he becomes a Christian, if you like. He has this conversion experience where he speaks of God taking him out of the miry pit and setting him up on the rock and so on. And then Patrick has one of his well-known visions. And this is a vision where he's told in the dream to leave the place of captivity, to move quite a long distance, and there, when he gets to the port, the harbour, a boat will be waiting for him. We're not sure where this is. Did he end up in some part of Europe, possibly, with the barbarian attacks and desolations when he speaks about going through this wilderness and so on. But that's a big empty place. But he does tell us that at some point in time he returns home to his family, and they of course tell him to never ever leave again, to stay with them. Very glad to see him.
But Patrick did leave again, although this time it was a vision rather than slavery that compelled him.
This vision is a beautiful vision where he dreams of a man called Victoricus. This man has a basket full of letters, and then I think the real point for Patrick is that he hears the voice, but it's the voice of the Irish, and they say, "Return to us, O holy boy, and come and walk with us once more."
Following his return in 432, Patrick sailed up the River Slaney, which today is a mere stream, and set foot on Irish soil just outside Saul. It is at this hilltop site at Saul that he is said to have made his first Irish convert, a local chief, who gave him a barn to use as a church. The barn may have long since gone, but since 1932, St. Patrick's Memorial Church has stood here in its stead. It was built to commemorate the 1500th anniversary of St. Patrick's Landing. There is no doubt that his mission had the full backing of the Roman Church, but what kind of man was he?
One document's called his Confession, which he wrote out when he was an old man. It's not very detailed in terms of a biography, but it gives us a real insight into what he was like, and we can pick out personal characteristics of humility, and honesty and so on, and bravery as well.
It was in his confession that Patrick wrote, "I came to the people of Ireland to preach the gospel and to suffer insult from the unbelievers, bearing the reproach of my going abroad, and many persecutions, even unto bonds, and to give my free birth for the benefit of others." But despite this compassion and strength of character, Patrick was very much a human being.
Another document was a letter to an English noble, Coroticus, and in that you see a very fierce Patrick, who's basically rebuking this man who sent his soldiers over to take converts, Patrick's converts, as slaves. So you see that Patrick obviously had a bad temper, if you like, righteous anger, if you can call that. So this is the historical Patrick.
Today, a statue of St. Patrick stares down from a hilltop near where he first landed in Ireland, symbolising his influence over not just this small part of Ulster, but the whole future of Ireland. But despite his high ideals, in order to achieve such influence, Patrick had to adopt very pragmatic means. It was for this reason that he travelled to Armagh. Today, Armagh is a city of just 12,000 people, but its importance far exceeds its size. Its graceful appearance, with many fine Georgian buildings, befits its status as a county town. It has its own observatory, located on College Hill, and nearby stands Ireland's only planetarium. But perhaps the most striking feature of this city is that it has two cathedrals, one Roman Catholic, the other Protestant. They sit on opposite hills, as if, as someone once said, they were the horns of a dilemma. And in many ways they are, for they provide a visible expression of the religious divide that has gripped the region for centuries. Yet they share a common root, as evidenced by the fact that they are both called St. Patrick's. So why did St. Patrick come here around the year 445?
Like a missionary bishop in any part of the world, he wanted to set up his church in a very clear way. And one way of doing that, of course, would be to go to a centre of political power, of royal power, and also of religious power. I mean, Ireland was not a land where people were running around in the midst of stupidity. They had their own gods, their own traditions, their own belief systems. And Armagh was a centre of that.
On the site of this 19th century house, known as St. Patrick's Fold, the missionary established his first church in Armagh. More importantly, he chose the city as the centre of the new religion and declared that it should take precedence over all other churches in Ireland. It has, ever since, remained the country's ecclesiastical capital. As such, it also became a centre of learning. So much so that in 1162, an ecclesiastical synod decreed that only those who had studied at Armagh could teach theology elsewhere in Ireland. It was this connection between Christianity and education that was to prove so influential in the years following St. Patrick. And the effect it had owed everything to the methods by which he chose to promote Christianity.
Oh, the green and red of Mayo, I can see it still. It's soft and craggy boglands, it's tall majestic hills, where the ocean kisses Ireland and the waves caress its shore. Oh, the feeling it came over me to stay forevermore, forevermore. From its rolling coastal waters I can see Croagh Patrick's Peak, where one Sunday every summer the pilgrims climbed the reek, where St. Patrick in its solitude looked down across Clough, and with the ringing of his bell called the faithful there to pray, there to pray.
Dominating the south shore of Clew Bay in County Mayo is a mountain renowned both for ancient legend and Christian spirituality. Today, Croagh Patrick offers a challenge in more ways than one. Every year, thousands of tourists attempt the long walk to the summit. Some, it must be said, find the climb easier than others.
Oh. Please God, let me make it.
I'm knackered.
Oh dear Lord. Now we know how he felt on his way to Calvary, and he fell 3 times.
Began to eat your heart out.
85 kilos dragging it up there. It's not fair on the body.
Years and years of smoking and drinking.
All those who eventually make it to the top are rewarded with magnificent views. But for some, there is also a spiritual reward. For, as well as being a tourist destination, Croagh Patrick is a place of pilgrimage. As they pause to reflect in the chapel that is perched on this peak, many people will recall how, centuries before, St. Patrick ascended to this same spot in his bid to bring Christianity to Ireland. At the time, the mountain was a sacred peak to the pagan god Crum, but rather than confront paganism, Patrick did quite the opposite. On his return, he told how he had battled for 40 days and nights with a legion of evil spirits, including the devil's mother, before crushing his foes and declaring the summit sacred to the Christian God. This rich image is drawn directly from Ireland's ancient tradition of storytelling that was also evident at places like Tara. By drawing upon it, Patrick was able to utilize existing beliefs in his efforts to propagate the Christian message. So, as the Celts converted to the new religion, they also remained loyal to their own cultural background.
It is interesting that right through that whole Celtic Christian period, that yes, they did recognise the importance of went before, the use of stone, the use of water and so on. In the various legendary accounts you see Patrick's affinity with nature and so on. So yes, these things were adopted, but there is a significant shift. But obviously it worked to their advantage, because you look at the success of the Christian mission in Ireland and it's quite phenomenal, and I think this in some ways explains it.
It is said that shortly before his death in the year 461, St. Patrick gave instructions for his body to be placed on a cart pulled by 2 wild oxen, and that he should be buried wherever the oxen stopped. Some believe that Patrick was buried at Saul, but it is generally held that St. Patrick's last resting place is here at Downpatrick, which until 1973 was the county town of County Down. Its name is partly derived from the saint and partly from the prefix Dún, the Irish name for an early pre-Christian fort. The original fort developed into an ecclesiastical city clustered round the cathedral, which is said to have been built on the site of St. Patrick's first stone church. And it is in the grounds of the cathedral that a granite slab marks what is claimed to be the saint's last resting place. Although the site may have ancient significance, the stone certainly does not, for it was placed here in the early 20th century. But just as Patrick harnessed legends in his life, so he has become the subject of them in his death.
The most common stories of Patrick, things like the shamrock and the stake, are very interesting. The shamrock, where St. Patrick is supposed to have taught the Trinity, I mean, it's such a well-recognised symbol. We think that the earliest record of the connection between Patrick and the shamrock dates back to the 17th century, which is very modern.
With the proliferation of such stories, it would seem that St. Patrick has himself become a part of the very folklore tradition that owes its continued existence to him. Evidence of the way that tradition has become intertwined with Christianity remains plentiful in the Ireland of today. Most of the holy wells, where people still come to pray, were also deemed holy in pre-Christian times. But the links to a magical past go beyond this. "1,400 years after the death of St. Patrick, the village of Knock in County Mayo was still nothing more than a quiet little settlement on a wind-swept ridge in the middle of a blanket bog.
Holy Mary, Mother of God.
Today, it attracts pilgrims from all over Ireland and beyond. It has gained a reputation as the Lourdes of Ireland, with the sick and disabled assuming prominent status among the huge crowds as they come here to pray for release from their afflictions. The basilica, which can hold 12,000 people, dominates the village. The devotion shown by the thousands of ordinary people who make the pilgrimage to Knock is genuinely moving, and proof enough, if proof were needed, of the grip that St. Patrick's Christian message took over Ireland.
New hope, courage and strength and happiness.
But the manner in which this once sparsely populated place was transformed also contains echoes of the distant past. It all began on a wet August evening in 1879, when 15 local people saw the figures of Mary, Joseph and St. John the Evangelist silhouetted on the gable of the local church. Following examination, a church commission accepted their account, and the era of pilgrimages was underway. Devotion to the shrine was further increased after 1979, when the Pope came to Ireland at the invitation of the local priest to celebrate the shrine's centenary. The Knock phenomenon has grown to a rare and exceptional degree, but there is nothing particularly exceptional about apparitions of the type that inspired it.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us.
In 1985, for example, thousands of people began to go on pilgrimages in various parts of Ireland, following numerous claims that statues had been seen moving. The Catholic authorities advised people to seek rational rather than supernatural explanations, but this did little to abate the flow of pilgrims until the strange sightings ceased as suddenly as they had begun. Among the byproducts of this episode was a book which included accounts of apparitions from the past, and a learned essay pointing out that the idea of moving statues had arisen in the Middle Ages and was the subject of many Irish tales and legends. It might be difficult to prove what really happened in Knock in 1879, but there is no doubt that the Celtic folklore tradition encompassed by St. Patrick's Christianity has remained as influential as ever down the centuries. Just as early Christianity found value in pre-existing practices, today's new religion of consumerism is also thriving, thanks to the presence of an old tradition. Back in the 5th century, crowds such as those at Knock would have been unthinkable, for Ireland's total population was only 500,000. Equally alien was the strong influence of the Church of Rome. Indeed, it was the very absence of Rome's influence that shaped the development of Ireland in the wake of St. Patrick. The Romans had never had the inclination to conquer Ireland. They already had more than enough on their hands, holding on to southern Britain. The absence of Roman influence from these lands meant there was none of the infrastructure of towns and cities that had grown up in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. In the years following St. Patrick's mission to Ireland, Christianity continued to grow in influence. But the Celtic Church acquired a unique identity that set it apart from what was happening elsewhere.
When Constantine converted to Christianity, the Roman Emperor Constantine, well then the Christian Church changed completely at that stage because they adopted the organization of the Roman Empire and their bishops and archbishops and that. They followed the civil divisions of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire had never come to Ireland, so when St. Patrick came to Ireland with his followers, then there was no civil structure. In fact, one could say that the civil structure of the Christian churches really is adopted from the Roman Empire. But in Ireland, the Roman civil structure didn't exist, so the church had to adopt itself to the actual tribal structure in Ireland that existed at the time. And with the result of that, a monastic system became predominant in Ireland, whereas the hierarchical administration of the Christian churches in the rest of Europe was based on the Roman Empire. In that period in Ireland, for 300 or 400 years, the monastic system predominated, and the bishops hadn't any authority except for confirmations and ordinations.
In Ireland's tribal society, bishops assumed the same status as a local king, with the monasteries coming under the authority of the abbots. This particularly suited the kinship-based social system.
As the monastic system became established in Ireland, each petty king tried to have a monastery in his area, and then they also tried to have one of their own family as abbot of that monastery. So that also was a great recruiting agent for the church as well, that the chieftains always tried to encourage members of their own family to join the monastery so that they would always have someone available to be abbot of the monastery when the abbotship became vacant in their own administrative area.
The monastery of Clonmacnoise in County Offaly is one of the most famous monastic sites in Ireland. It is the burial place of the kings of Connacht and Tara, as well as Rory O'Connor, the last High King of Ireland, who was laid to rest here in 1198. Although none of the surviving ruins is earlier than the 9th century, the settlement dates back to 545, when it was founded by St. Kieran. While training under St. Enda, Kieran is said to have had a vision of a great tree growing in the centre of Ireland. St. Enda interpreted this as a church founded on the banks of the Shannon, and so it was that Kieran came to settle here. As Christianity took hold in Ireland, monasteries such as this became centres of population.
They didn't just concern them with religious matters. They had a room for travellers. If people were travelling, they could stay in the monastery. They had a hospital, or the equivalent of the hospital at the time, and they were very good organised agriculturalists. They had their own mill and all of that. So they were a major economic factor. A monastic settlement was a major economic factor in its area. Not all of the people involved in the monasteries would have been monks at the time. Some of them would have been, but others would have been just associated with the monastery, working with it. They generally had hundreds of acres of land and stores and that, so they were a major factor in an area.
Another aspect of monastic life was their schools, where the monks taught church Latin and the study of religious texts. Libraries contained copies of the scriptures, some classical authors and some history. All this meant that, as well as allowing the tradition of storytelling to live on, through the introduction of Latin, Christianity gave Ireland a written language for the first time.
When the St. Patrick came to Ireland, there wasn't really any written language in Ireland at that time. There was some basic writing for monuments and that called Ogham, but it wasn't really developed enough to put literature down in a recorded form. So the first recordings of the history of Ireland were done by the monks in the monasteries. Before that, you just had an oral tradition which was recorded the events in song and passed down in stories and that. So those were recorded by the monks in annals and so on. So there's more of the early Irish history survives than in most other countries because those monasteries wrote a lot of it down, the old Irish writing.
By 500 AD, the Roman Empire had declined, leaving a vacuum that plunged most of Europe into the Dark Ages. From being a major force, Christianity was threatened by a reversion to paganism. But for Ireland, it was a golden age, and the Celtic Church became an oasis of learning.
Most of the great Roman libraries, or all of the great Roman libraries, were destroyed by the invasion of the tribes from the east. But copies of a lot of those textbooks were made in the Irish Church and existed, and when the Irish monks went back into Europe, they carried that knowledge back in with them to Europe. The knowledge of the classical Greek language had died out in Europe, and it was only survived in the Irish monastic system. So that allowed the Greek knowledge of the Greek civilization and the Roman civilization to survive.
It was as if Ireland had been holding Europe's heritage in a time capsule, ready for the day when it could be returned. Among the monks who spread Christianity back out from Ireland's monasteries was a royal prince of Ulster, a member of the powerful northern O'Neill clan. Today, Columkill, or St. Columba, as he is sometimes known, is remembered here at Garton in County Donegal, the place of his birth. He was destined for a religious life from the very beginning, for when the time came for him to be fostered, as was the Irish custom, he was placed with the priest who had baptized him. Since clerical and secular power were regarded as complementary in early Ireland, a religious role would have been seen as prestigious by his family. Following an extensive ecclesiastical education, Columkill went on to found numerous monasteries in Ireland, proving himself to be both determined and capable. But conflict awaited him. While he had been building monasteries, Diarmid, one of the southern O'Neill clan, had been cementing his grip on the kingship of Tara. By 558, he was powerful enough to effectively declare himself High King. The northern O'Neills were bound to oppose this claim, and a clash was inevitable. Columkill's personal involvement in the ensuing battle was probably motivated by the close relationship Diarmid had developed with the Druids. Columkill was strongly opposed to a High King who supported paganism. Even more so, one who clashed with his family's interests. 3,000 died in the battle, and it is believed that Columkill's remorse at his part in the slaughter led him to eventually seek voluntary exile. And so it was that in 563 AD, accompanied by 12 followers, Columkill sailed north and landed on the remote Scottish island of Iona. The settlement he founded on Iona still exists today. Although such self-imposed exile may seem extreme in today's world, it was consistent with the thinking of the 6th century.
Recent analysis of the texts that survive from that time indicate that the Irish monastic system was very tied up with the study of the martyrs in the church, those that were put to death because of their beliefs in the early Roman Empire. And at that time, it was a big thing to leave your own civilization and go into a strange civilization. And they felt that they were doing something similar by going out into other countries to preach the gospel. They were breaking the connection with their own families and own civilization. And they felt that was the equivalent of martyrdom.
It is from Iona that the Christian message was spread out back across Britain and Europe. But Columkill's success in carrying out his mission owed much to his family connections.
Now, because he was from the royal family in Ireland, he had access to the kings in Scotland. even though they weren't Christians, they still accepted him into their courts and gave him land to form monastic settlements. Of course, those monastic settlements didn't just deal with religious things. They had the equivalent of hospitals in those days. So they brought a lot of skills to an area. So the kings would have seen those as an economic advantage to have them there. They wouldn't have seen them necessarily as a religious thing. Subsequent to Columbkill's death, the monks from Iona and various other Columban settlements spread out over Europe and brought Christianity back into the Rhine Valley and northern Italy and into France. And if one looks up the records of that period of Christianity from about 600 to 900 and even later on to 10 or 1100 AD, you will find a huge number of names of bishops there that are Irish. In fact, some of the dioceses in the Rhine Valley had Irish bishops for up to 200 or 300 years. They always came to the Irish Church for their bishops. So the actual impact of the Irish Christianity in Europe at that time was vital. Without that, it's doubtful if Christianity would have survived as a major force in Europe.
From a forgotten land on the remote edge of a continent, Ireland had been transformed into the cradle from which that continent's destiny would be reborn. On the way, it had gathered together the seeds of its own unique identity, which, in one form or another, would remain with it even to the present day. The Celtic Christian culture produced many works of great beauty. Among the most famous to have survived is the Book of Kells, an illustrated manuscript of the Gospels, which was produced in Kells Monastery in the 8th century. Other surviving Celtic legacies include the many sandstone high crosses that are scattered across the Irish landscape. Most of them date from the same period as the Book of Kells, for their elaborate carvings were designed as a means of teaching Bible stories. The scenes depicted include saints, scriptural scenes, and judgment scenes. These rich symbols are proof indeed that Ireland had truly become the land of saints and scholars. But how long could this golden age survive? By the 9th century, as Viking invaders stormed up Ireland's coast and rivers, the monasteries were prime targets. Many of the tall towers found at monastic settlements were built as lookouts and refuges against Norse invaders. But the Vikings did more than simply plunder. They began to settle as traders, and the settlements they founded would later grow into Ireland's first towns and cities. One such city is Limerick, whose Viking origins are revealed in its name, which comes from the Norse for rich land. It was founded by Danish Vikings with the purpose of using it as a base from which to plunder the rich agricultural hinterland. Modern Limerick is Ireland's 4th largest city and the main administrative and commercial centre of the Midwest region. On the north bank of the Abbey River, an eastern tributary of the Shannon, lies the historic centre known as Englishtown. Here there are many examples of fine medieval architecture. This area also contains the city's oldest building, the Anglican Cathedral. Next to where the Thomond Bridge crosses the Shannon stands King John's Castle. Originally built as a Norman fortification, the tower, built in around 1200, is the oldest surviving part. The castle has been an important bastion down several centuries. Opposite Englishtown, on the south bank of the Abbey River, is Irishtown. The architecture here is of generally more recent origin. John Square, for example, was started in 1751. The 3-story houses that border the square on 3 sides were originally occupied by the wealthier citizens of Limerick. On the southern edge of the old Irish town is St. John's Roman Catholic Cathedral, built in 1861. The 280-foot spire, completed 22 years after the main building, is the tallest in Ireland. Just as Irishtown was a development out from the historic centre, So the district known as Newtown Perry reflects a further expansion of the city southwards. With its many Georgian houses and wide parallel streets, it is a fine example of 18th century town planning. There is a traditional claim amongst Irish people that they detest Limerick, but with its impressive buildings, wide bridges and old quays, it is hard to understand why. It is true that many of the city's leading industries, such as grain milling, that were developed towards the end of the 19th century have since declined. However, with the more recent arrival of modern businesses like computer manufacturing and electronics, Limerick has gained a new lease of life. This is reflected in the busy shopping streets that give it a lively atmosphere. Like other Viking cities, Limerick endured centuries of turmoil following its foundation. At the heart of the turmoil was not just the resistance of the native Irish to the Vikings, but the squabbles between the many petty Irish kingdoms that had persisted since pagan times. Although the notion of a high king uniting the whole of Ireland had grown up, the incumbent had never really been more than a figurehead. But all that was to change. At the monastery of Clonmacnoise, a young man called Brian, youngest son of King Cnaithig MacLurcan of Thomond, was receiving his education. His appetite for reading histories of the military leaders of Europe would one day help him become a great military tactician. He was still in his teens when his brother sent for him to learn the ways of the warrior and to take his place fighting the Norsemen at Limerick. Some years later, in 962, he found himself here, in the hills of Clare. He had fallen out with his brother, the King of Thomond, about making peace with the Norse, and was leading a handful of followers in a guerrilla war against the Norse of Limerick. The skirmishes lasted several years, and finally Brian, with about 15 warriors remaining, returned to the King of Thomond. What happened next was centered around this outcrop of limestone that rises imposingly from the Tipperary plain. It is easy to see why the Rock of Cashel, with its commanding position, was a place of great importance in the 10th century. The capital of Munster, Ireland's largest province, it was at the center of the fighting that was taking place between the many branches of the McCarthy clan for the right to be king of this region. The buildings we find on the rock today date from different periods, the earliest being of 12th century origin, and the site was given to the ecclesiastical authorities. It was nevertheless to this very place that Brian's clan marched, and it was here that his brother was proclaimed and crowned King of Munster in 968, after destroying the Norsemen of Limerick. It was 10 years after the crowning of his brother that Brian himself was crowned King of Thomond, and after that, King of Munster, on the coronation stone here at the Rock of Cashel. Around this time, he married for a second time, probably tactically, as a means of gaining power against the mighty O'Neill clan. It was here at Killaloe, on the eastern edge of County Clare on the shore of Lough Derg, that Brian established his palace. Today, Killaloe is a popular fishing centre and the southern limit for cruising and yachting on the River Shannon. But in the 10th century, the palace of Kincora that stood on this site was the most magnificent palace that any Irish king had occupied up to that time. From his palace, Brian would entertain his guests and shower them with gifts, setting new standards for hospitality. His enemies were treated the same as friends and allies, for, perhaps because of his early studies, he had developed into a master negotiator and diplomat. From 978 to 988, he fought numerous battles to subdue local warring factions and gradually gained control of the whole of the southern half of Ireland. As Irish law allowed for more than one wife at a time, Brian made skillful use of marriage to increase his influence. By marrying the mother of the future Viking king of Dublin, he gained allegiance with the Viking element. In the year 1002, he obtained the fruit of his labours, the high kingship. For the first time, Ireland would be ruled by one king who was more than a mere figurehead. All the petty kings would enforce his orders. He liberally endowed the scholastic and monastic institutions and sent emissaries to Europe to find and replace the tens of thousands of books that had been destroyed during Irish and Viking raids. He sought nothing less than to restore Ireland as the land of saints and scholars. 1 mile north of Killaloe is the site of an ancient fort. It was to here that Irishmen drove their cattle in order to pay their taxes to the king, for cattle was then the currency of Ireland. The Gaelic word for cattle tax was boruma, and it was through his association with this that Brian became known as Brian Boruma, or Brian Boru, as he is called today. The taxes gathered at places such as this led to unrest, and at the end of the year 1012, Leinster and Dublin began to rebel. A year later, at the age of 73, Brian Boru saw his life's work start to fall apart. The High King began to assemble his forces to meet the rebels, and on Good Friday of 1014, at Clontarf, near Dublin, his final battle commenced. He himself was too old to fight, but his troops won the battle. As he knelt in his tent and prayed thanks, a fleeing Viking chief came upon him and cleaved the bare head of the High King of Ireland. The 12 short years during which Brian Boru held the High Kingship are remembered here in Armagh, where the remains of his body were finally laid to rest. Brian Boru's reign was the only period in the whole history of this land that total unity and self-government prevailed over the entire island. Jerpoint Abbey in County Kilkenny is evidence of how things changed in the years following Boru's death. Although a strong monastic tradition continued, there was a significant change in direction. For this 12th century site was established by the Cistercians. Unlike earlier monastic settlements, which were centres of the community, those founded by the Cistercians were located at remote sites like this. This move away from a traditional Irish pattern reflected how the church in Ireland, previously so distinctive, was now beginning to follow a more Roman structure. Although prompted by 4 synods that were held in the first half of the 12th century, the growing influence of Rome reflects how the church, like the country itself, fell into disarray with the loss of a strong high kingship. Although there was no shortage of aspirants to Boru's crown, the incohesive nature of Irish society made it impossible for any of them to assert their authority.
The kingship didn't go on a primogeniture. It was actually within the clan, and anyone within second cousins of the king was eligible to be elected as king. And when the king died, then there was a meeting to elect a new king. It was a good system in the sense that you probably get better people appointed as king, but it was a very bad system for generating conflict. And it was one of the weaknesses of the Celtic civilization. The Romans made use of it, and the Normans' invasion of Ireland made use of that as well, because whenever a king died, a conflict or a potential conflict situation was created, and by manipulating that, outsiders could have a great effect on an area or on a country.
Although the inherent weaknesses of Celtic society made it easy for the Normans to gain a foothold in Ireland, the strength of its proudly assertive traditions meant that there would always be an undercurrent of resistance. And so the foundations were laid for the Anglo-Irish conflict that would dominate the story of Ireland. in the centuries ahead.